Hi everyone, my name is Eran Kinsbruner and I want to welcome you all to this webinar by Perfecto, Automation Firehose, Be Strategic and Tactical. Most of this webinar is going to be led by Thomas Haver, colleague, friend, and expert in test automation. So before I hand it over to Thomas, I just want to start with the very basic housekeeping information for those of you who are joining. So this webinar is obviously recorded, and the recording will be made available to all of you after the webinar. The slides and the material are also in the resources of this webinar. So you can find it there embedded in the webinar panel. Feel free to ask questions during this webinar. Myself and Thomas will be trying to address any questions that you might have during or after the webinar. You know, I've seen the slides, I've seen the material. It's really exciting to have Thomas here with us. It's an amazing set of insights that Thomas is going to walk us through. So without further ado, Thomas, as a international speaker, test automation architect for enterprises across so many verticals, I will let you introduce yourself even further, but welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the opportunity to talk about strategy and tactics for automation. You may notice we have Thanos here on the title screen, and that is because this is a themed presentation after the Avengers. So something that's exciting to do at conferences is to theme your presentation to make it a little bit more exciting for the audience. So we're going in with a comic book style today. So we're going to be talking about the best strategy and tactics that you can use in your approach, whether it be for a single team or for your enterprise as regards to test automation. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background material in terms of an origin story for the automation challenges to see that many of the challenges we faced 20 years ago are the same challenges we're facing today, as well as what are the appropriate framework and tools for you to select for your team? What is the approach you should take? What are some of the common challenges that we stumble across, as well as how to schedule and integrate automation into your life cycle? At the very end of the presentation, I actually include some metrics. It won't be intended for the speaking portion, but it's instead intended for folks who want access to the presentation afterwards. So if you're signed up for it, Perfecto will make that available for anyone who wants it. So a little bit about myself. So as Eran mentioned, my name is Thomas Haver. I work as an automation architect out of Columbus, Ohio. If you want to get into contact with me afterwards, you can contact me on Twitter at @cogsfun, or you can check me out on my blog that I set up with my team called Red Green Refactor. So before I was in IT for around a decade, I worked in research science and molecular spectroscopy and microscopy. Eventually made my way into a different technical area. But one of my biggest loves is actually board games. I own over 2,000 board games. I'm also an evangelist for Ruby Cucumber. You'll see it later in this presentation. Columbus is very much a cluster city for the adoption of Ruby Cucumber because a lot of us started at a single firm, grew Ruby Cucumber, and then spread out to other Fortune 500 companies. And this is my adorable cartoon family. They are real, and I appreciate them putting up with all of my board games that are spilling out of every room of the house. So a little bit of background. We're trying to help establish a shared understanding amongst all of us here when we talk about strategy and tactics, as well as the challenges that we face as it corresponds to test automation. When I say strategy, what I mean is it's a plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major or overall aim. When we talk about tactics in this presentation, we mean the art or skill of employing available means to accomplish an end. So for example, for those of you who are familiar with the Avengers Infinity War movie, Star-Lord here, as pictured, had a great strategy for defeating Thanos, but it was his own emotional tactics that ended up costing his team the win, and Thanos was able to snap away half of the universe. So with this in mind, let's look a little bit into the history of test automation. We go way back to 2004. Microsoft maintained a pretty active blog on testing and the active development of Internet Explorer as well as the Windows platform. They had a big challenge in 2004. with regards to their test coverage. They had way too many combinations of Internet Explorer to test for every single release or every single patch that they would go through. Here are just some of the combinations that you have available, where if they're testing Internet Explorer, they have to look at all of these service packs, all of these operating systems, and I'm not even showing here the 26 different language binaries that they had to address. So how can they actually approach this problem? Even for a company the size of Microsoft, it is impossible to test all of these combinations. Well, back then, they took an approach that we commonly refer to now as a persona-based testing, where they grouped together similar types of setups into buckets that matched customer profiles. And they tested those profiles and applied the learnings they had to every other bit of combination within that bucket. Because they're limited in their time and the scope of their testing, they have to make do with choosing a risk-based approach. We want to do the same thing with our automation. For the longest time, automation has always promised that it's going to save you time and lower costs while raising quality, something that's seemingly impossible. But as we learn and adopt automation, we find out that there are many ways that we can approach it, but only a few ways that we can actually be successful and successful long term. We just have to do a lot of upfront planning as well as introduce a lot of guardrails to help make sure that we follow the right path to reach our destination. So what do I mean about like the promises of automation? Well, again, we go back to a book that's more than a decade old, Implementing Automated Software Testing by Alfredi Dustin, where as the state of your application reaches a sort of brownfield or a legacy application, so the number of features grow, the cost and time to deliver increases, whereas your ability to test it and ensure quality of that application declines. At a certain point, right, people will often promise to sprinkle the magic fairy dust of automation. That's what that yellow bar is in between. And after which, hey, magically, we're able to increase quality and test coverage and reduce time and cost. Well, initially, you may see some benefits. As that automation itself turns into a legacy system, the maintenance costs often become large. The design decisions that you made often off the cuff will come back to bite you. And so we have to take great care as an upfront concern and as an ongoing concern to make sure that we address the maintenance costs, the skill set of our employees, and the overall tactics we use to deliver quality in our overall automation approach. So what do we talk about in terms of strategy that we can use for an enterprise or a single team? Well, these are the general categories that I generally look at when we're talking about automation for an entire enterprise. So what is the scope of this automation program? What are the measurable objectives that we have? What is the approach we're going to take within that, those sort of tactics? What are the framework and tools we're going to select? What environments do we have to work in? How do we work this into our delivery schedule? And lastly, and I think one of the important components, is the technical skill set of our people. If you choose the wrong framework and tools for the people, it's not going to be successful. If you set up objectives that are impossible to reach because your people aren't trained, you're not going to be successful. So it's important to keep all of these components in mind in terms of your overall strategy. Let's start off with our approach. How do we make sure that we're trying to automate the right things, or even that we're even capable of automating a given scenario? As a general rule, what I like to do is provide my team with a sort of checklist. I don't make this a toll gate for them, but this checklist is something that's used in tasking sessions or requirements gathering, so they can upfront make a determination of whether or not something can be automated. For instance, is it something that's going to be repeated, and how often? How much time can you save? Are the requirements something that's going to be stable, or are you going to have it be changed quite often? Do you have a lot of human error associated, or at least do you predict a lot of human error? And is it something that is time consuming or repetitive? Even though it's something that's simple, if it's a repetitive task, that's something we don't want people to do. We want them to do more value added tasks. So using a sort of checklist with the example I provided here is useful to arm your team, because you want each person responsible for automation to have similar standards, regardless of what team that they're supporting or what feature they're working on, to make things more even across the board for which tests are actually targeted for automation versus which ones are not good candidates.
And Thomas, if I can just highlight a point, I think this is something that I don't see quite often. This checklist, or kind of, I would call it like a level of certification of a test case. You want to certify or ask these questions when you are developing a test, especially as you move forward, because this will help you also prioritize things. And time is one of the biggest assets that we don't have enough of in Agile and DevOps. So when you follow such a checklist, you actually prioritize things and maybe increase your chances of releasing things in more like a time fashion, and reduce the manual headache. That's an obvious statement.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. As Jean-Claude Van Damme said in Time Cop, there is never enough time.
Yeah.
You'll get the movie references with me in most of my presentations, and this actually leads into the automation costs. So that was a good point to bring up, that when we are writing automation, we should try to treat it the same way we do development code, with the same standards that we expect from the development code. Our automation framework is just another application whose purpose is to test other applications. So what should we factor in? Though, those maintenance costs. So every time that we commit to writing a test, that means we're committing to maintaining that script for the rest of time, or until we remove it. So that should lead into your decision making of whether or not you actually write those scripts. There's a whole bunch of costs that are associated with automation that we don't often think of up front, like the tooling itself that we're going to purchase, whether we're going to go open source or commercial, the ancillary tools that support that, as well as when we have to make operating system upgrades or language upgrades. Again, this is another application that we have to support. It's not something that we can sprinkle that magic fairy dust on. It'll be perfect. We additionally have things like documentation and implementation and onboarding that will take up our time and will continue to take up more time as we have people join the team or leave the team, as we make changes or even start on brand new projects that cause us to spin up new greenfield projects, and we have to adopt automation for it. So it's important to take into account all of these costs when building out automation. They should be factored into that return on investment. We additionally have some organizational constraints. As Eran mentioned, we don't have infinite amount of time. We additionally have constraints that are placed upon us from our company. And that could be our delivery schedule, our project budget, as well as this technical skill set of the people in our office. So we should instead try to automate based upon the frequency of use, criticality, and legal risk for our automation scripts to get to those most valuable scripts. So we want to look for areas that have a lot of complex manual scenarios, especially those that require a lot of data or environment setup, and build automation around that. Reduce that human load so humans can do more valuable tasks. But it's easy for me to say right now, like, all right, automate based on criticality or legal risk. But like, how do you actually make that determination live in the course of a project? Well, that's where I show some of our organizational constraints. What I would recommend, in addition to that checklist, is use something akin to a scorecard. Now, I have a simple scorecard here for a sample, broken down by feature of login or bill pay or bank-to-bank transfer or spend analyzer. For each one of those features, or you can make them individual scenarios, what you want to do is to have a set of criteria, your sort of critical success factors to judge these scenarios by. here I just list 4. In some instances, I've used up to 10. And these are judgments of, hey, is this something on the critical path or something that's frequently used? Do we require to actually test this because there's a legal issue? Or is there a lot of data and environmental setup? Is this something that has a lot of reuse? And so you can make your judgment call by either simple check boxes, as I've shown here for simplification, or going low, medium, high, or even a scoring system, since this is the scorecard, going from a scale of, say, 0 to 10, where if you don't test this given feature, you're going to be hit because you're not SOX compliant or you're going to break ADA rules. Those are ones that you get a 10, and you want to automate those. So by creating the scorecard, you'll end up creating your priority of the ones that are most valuable, receive the highest score, the highest priority, are the ones you're going to work on first. So you can always fit within that constraint of the delivery timelines and the project budget. You want to establish a threshold. At this certain point, we identify these as good automation candidates, and we want to automate everything. And we're going to work top down from those most valuable to the least valuable. So anything that is left open that you haven't been able to complete within that time box, you can at least identify as technical debt and have a good idea of what you are missing if you end up missing anything. So this brings me to a larger point when we're talking about the approach to our automation and what should we automate. A lot of it involves us negotiating with management or C-level executives about the purpose of automation and what is good versus bad automation. So just as a reminder, good automation will help testers do their job. It's not there to replace them. It is a tool that you can use to help enhance your testing. Good automation should be baked into your SDLC as an upfront concern and not something that's done after the project goes to production. It's not something you should keep as simple automated checks. As we see in the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence, people are using automation in more creative ways to do more valuable tasks for us. Those automation executions should also be something that is focused and informative. Is an actual value added according to your automation scorecard. And they should be trustworthy and repeatable. If you keep on sending off reports that have half of your automation suite failing, eventually your stakeholders will stop following, your developers will stop following, and even members of your automation team will stop following because they don't trust it. The test that you execute should be trustworthy. A high degree of confidence that they are actually passing as passing, and failures are something that you need to investigate as defects rather than, oh, today's bad because the environment's having trouble, or we just went through a database refresh. Building up that trust is a key component to having good test automation. Next, we jump into the selection of frameworks and tooling for automation. The short answer for this entire section is there is no one best framework or tool that you can use. Hence the reason why there are literally dozens of different automation solutions out there, either commercial or open source. It's about trying to find the right tool and framework for your particular company at that point in time. For here, as an example, I'll explain a little bit about what led into my selection of a tool and why I'm an evangelist for Ruby Cucumber. That I care about making the automation visible to all members of the team, something that I can take also to C-level executives. The easiest way to make things real for them, in my opinion, is to use a language that they understand. And that's why I like Cucumber and in particular Gherkin, because that top layer is written in a domain-specific language. So this way they can see, all right, this is what the automation is doing. And it works well to help establish a shared understanding. So Cucumber itself is not a tool for automated testing. That is not its ultimate goal. Its goal is to establish a shared understanding by having the team collaborate. And if we're going to write automated tests, we certainly want the teams to understand what we should be testing and collaborate from the perspective of user behaviors. So in the case of, say, using Ruby Cucumber for a web test, web is likely one of the most popular types of application under test. And so using Selenium is also one of the most popular tools as an open source tool to use. So why would you, making a selection for your company, say, I'm going to go Selenium and then Ruby Cucumber? You may not go with Ruby Cucumber. If you're working on web, you will most likely select Selenium because why? Well, Selenium is an open source tool that has been implemented in many different languages that can handle all the browsers that you care about. So why is it important for these different languages? Well, the farther I go into my automation career, the more I come to the conclusion that we should try to select an automation tool that lines up as best we can with our existing tech stack. What I mean by that specifically is if you can have your automated tests be written in the same language as the application under test, even better, because then you can move to a state of polyskilling, of having your developers and testers collaborate on those automated tests and have the automation code live in the same place as the development code. This is about creating that shared understanding amongst the team about what do we need to test and why, and what is the current state of the application. Selecting a framework and tool that aligns with your current company's tech stack and makes it easy for as many people as possible in your org to use is the ideal tool to use. So it's okay to not select Ruby Cucumber or not go with Java Selenium. It's okay to select WebDriver or Protractor. There's a whole host of tools out there, but it's just important for you to select the best tool that matches your company's profile. So also in selecting our framework and tools, we have to make the consideration for the members of our team and how much time are they actually going to spend developing this automation. I like to build automation frameworks like I would do Lego for myself or my kids. Bit by bit, building up these blocks that are easy for them to use so they can build ultimately the end goal, which is a automation suite that is sustainable and extensible and easy to maintain. So what I've done here is have a simple automation script that's written in a very imperative style. That is, we're focused on those user actions. This is just an intermediate step. The intermediate step is important because if you look, you'll see that I've got a lot of highly reusable code in here for a web application. The user clicks insert name here for whatever page element I want to click on. That can be used for every single object on a web page that I want to click on. So in those 5 lines of code, I'm done. I got it ready to go. In the same way that I want to identify that a user is on or navigates to a given web page, I can use that again and again for all web applications. In my last 2 stints, I've worked at companies on a large scale, an enterprise scale. One, I covered 73 applications with my team, of which 41 of those were web applications. Being able to use the same framework across all of those applications makes it very easy for us to make changes en masse, makes it very easy for us to troubleshoot, and makes it easier for us to train people and have them be cross-team functional. I noted at the beginning, I said this is an intermediate step. And the reason for that is those are written in very imperative style of how the user is interacting with the system. If we want to talk about describing the behaviors that our users are interacting with the system, what you should do is use those little imperatives and lead to application-specific declarative steps for what the user is doing. So you can refactor out the UI, make it independent of what UI you're interacting with. So this is something that will help with the readability for all other members of the team as a point of collaboration, as well as help build up that domain knowledge for the members of your team. But keeping in mind, you still have all these little code Lego underneath that you can snap together to make it really easy for people who have never coded before, learn it and pick it up and be successful. So it's about taking a step-by-step approach with your automation code standards.
Thomas, I think, and you just mentioned it, I just want to reiterate because that's an important thing. And I'm also a BDD practitioner myself, and I think the combination of step definition with the Gherkin style is like a very good match, not just from a skill set perspective, but also, as you mentioned, from the building blocks perspective, from the maintainability of both the code and the scenarios. So I think that's a very cool approach, that allows you to continuously improve your test automation and also maintain it as things change.
Yep, and it's all about that maturity of building up the good habits by the people you're working with. And keep in mind, if you start to work with people who have no coding experience, they don't have good or bad habits because they just don't have habits. So you scale them up to be successful and build up these good habits, and you're going to have people that are going to be great practitioners.
Definitely.
Yeah. So one of the other areas that I think is very important, and this is one that I have taken great consideration into the farther I've gone into my career in IT, is using those personas. Now, I mentioned early on about the history that went back 16 years about how Microsoft addressed Internet Explorer testing by using those sort of customer buckets. We want to use personas to aid us in our testing, to focus on those most valuable tests. So Alan Cooper, author of The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, said personas are incredibly useful when you don't have easy access to real users, because they can act as those user stand-ins, helping to guide your decisions about the functionality and design. So think about this from an automation standpoint, or just purely testing standpoint. How Vision would interact with your application is different than how Hulk would, is different as how Nick Fury would interact, is different to how Spider-Man would interact. These are personas that you would end up creating, so that way your overall testing coverage is improved and you're focused on that end user behavior. So they're going to help us if we write personas into our automation to help prioritize those features, focus on those target users, and provide a consistent view of them. You can use marketing data to help drive those automated tests. So for example, we use marketing data to help drive our automated tests. So this is the heat map as well as test execution from Perfecto that we use for one of our personas. We use marketing data from Adobe Analytics to understand what are the most popular devices, what are the most popular browsers that people are using, as well as what are the most common flows that people take through our application, as well as points where they jump off of our application because maybe the user experience wasn't great. This allows us to generate personas and focus our testing on the people that drive our business by using the most popular devices, by using the geolocation that match the time zones in which our customer base is in, using the network profile that matches them. Someone who's sitting at home will have a different network profile than those in a very busy department store, as well as a lot of the background apps that are the source of a lot of the promotions that will drive people to using our app. That's not something that's easily set up if you're going to do that manually. So you'd want to use it in an automated fashion, in this case using a cloud platform to help simulate all of this. So that way our personas will become just another variable for our testing. And when we create our personas, we create very simple monosyllabic names and include descriptions that we just simply pass through as that variable for our execution. So that way, when we're doing development work, we can do it focused on those personas. When we're testing, we do it focused on those personas. So keeping in mind what the customer is doing and how they're interacting with our application is key to us being successful.
And Thomas, I think speaking, from Perfecto, the reason behind this all persona-based approach, I think, was to allow, users of the platform as well as practitioners that, just look at testing from a user perspective approach, having the ability when you are designing your test automation from a persona standpoint, it's very easy for you to change it. We are in a digital landscape. So let's say your data, your Adobe data was showing that someone is using this environment and this platform. Obviously, in the next 2 or 3 months, things will change. So changing and customizing your persona as the market and your product evolves is a huge benefit from your ongoing test maintainability.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very powerful technique, and it's something that you should build into your overall strategy for automation, understanding your users and designing tests towards them. Now, to this point in time, I've spoken a lot about automated testing from the perspective of interacting with the UI, our sort of functional UI tests. And I don't want to give short shrift to actually the most valuable sorts of tests. And those are integration and unit tests. So if we're going to use integration testing, they should take a high priority. Where we're testing our interfaces or modules, obviously doing this on a service layer. This is to help us ensure that everything is working as expected, and understanding that it is actually something that is more robust than those UI tests that can be flaky. Running those UI tests will help identify flaky ones, and we saw from the prior picture on here that we actually had a flaky test. If I go back one, that failed, passed. Well, we don't want to have flaky tests ideally. Integration tests will run more quickly for us and be able to give us that feedback. And just like functional UI automation, there are a whole host of tools and frameworks that you can use that will match your development code base. So you should take an integration testing approach that values it as an upfront concern. In a similar vein, unit testing is the fastest method of testing, and therefore should be the highest priority for your testing. And that is because it's easier to debug, these are highly reusable, it's a low cost to fix, and there's a whole host of frameworks that you can use to implement this, regardless of what your programming language is. So in terms of priorities, unit testing should take the top priority, followed by integration, followed by functional testing. But you shouldn't exclude any one of those three. Those should all be baked into your overall objectives for automation. In our next section, I'm going to cover a number of the common challenges you face with regards to automation testing. The beginning of this presentation, on the title slide, I said the automation firehose. Now we get to actually find out what that is. The automation firehose is a team automating anything and everything just because they have the ability to. Just because you can automate it doesn't mean that you should. Instead, you should focus on adopting that risk-based approach such that you're only automating the most valuable tests. Because again, going back to those maintenance costs, if you automate a whole slew of tests that are going to require a great deal of upkeep, that are going to be potentially flaky, then you are investing additional time that you possibly don't have, as well as money that you possibly don't have. So you need to take great care in automating those most valuable features and making sure that they're automated correctly for long-term sustainability. Additionally, I commonly see issues related to data. This is not an automation issue. This is an overall testing issue. You have a script and you execute, great, and it's successful, and it passes in a given environment. And your application gets promoted to the new environment and deployed, and your tests fail. Why? Because maybe the login doesn't work anymore, or the data you're referencing in there is no longer good, it's stale, or it doesn't even exist. So it's important as an upfront concern to make sure that your automation is cross-environment compatible, up to and including production. So that means as an upfront concern, you want to have access to your data, be able to generate it and manipulate it. You should include it in whatever ready and done straight criteria you have. That, for one thing, you have access to the data as an entry state criteria for the development team to begin work. And for another, that you have successfully executed your test in multiple environments, or at least shown that it has the capability to execute in multiple environments. Looking at it from purely a value proposition. If one of the promises of automation is to provide you that test coverage and it's unattended execution for those checks, but your test that you just wrote can only work in a single environment under a single circumstance, then you are not maximizing the benefits of your automated test. And it could be that the maintenance and the time for you to write it is greater than if you just manually tested it if you don't have access to data across multiple environments. So making this an upfront concern will ensure you help maximize the ROI on your automation. I mentioned a couple times flaky tests. These are often also called flickering tests. So you have a test that executes, passes, you run it again, fail, execute, pass, execute again, fail. It seemingly flickers on and off. Well, too bad, we're on to the next project. So we'll work on those later. No, you should not take that approach. That will make Hulk very angry. So automation tests that don't consistently pass are soon ignored by the rest of the team. Remember, we need to build up that trust with the rest of the team, that failures are indeed true failures and not due to the way in which we coded it or lack of data or poor environment. So what I recommend is an approach that should be very familiar to everyone here living in our current crisis is quarantine. Quarantine those flickering tests. Investigate, why did they fail? For one, you don't want those tests to execute in your regular, say, regression or project level tests because they are flickering to help maintain that confidence. And for another, you want to address what is now technical debt. Figure out, is it because you did not code it correctly, data, environment, or is there some other sort of insidious reason that is actually a true defect that is causing the application to behave in this flickering manner? So remove those tests and investigate. Another issue that I commonly see are with long tests. So you have one script and it's 300 steps long and it validates probably 100 different things. That can be really tricky. If you have a failure at any point along the way, does your test actually continue executing or do you skip out on the rest of those validations? So you know you may have one issue, you don't know about the rest of the test. As well as the readability concern. If you execute these tests, great. If you try to understand what the test purpose is and it's 300 lines long, your eyes are going to get glassy probably after 10 steps. You need to keep your tests short and sweet. They need to be focused. So use unit and integration tests because those are the short tests you're going to use. Those UI tests, those functional tests, should look at end-to-end user behavior ideally and be written in a declarative style that keeps it very short. If we go back to one of those principles of testing, that each test should ideally test one thing, no more, no less, we should try to validate that behavior with our automated tests. So that way we can keep it short and keep it focused and make it easier for our reader to understand what the test purpose actually is. Another common failing point is building it on that shaky foundation. And I've worked at a company that took this approach. We automate for the next day, as in just get us through to the next day and not a month from now or a year from now or 5 years from now when we've moved on to another company. That often led to, in a couple years, entire teams just deciding to throw away their existing automation and building up a new framework from scratch, but making those same mistakes again. It's important that when you are working, you take a craftsman approach to your automation. You don't want to build on a shaky foundation. Instead, you want to architect your framework such that it follows those best practices or good practices from the development community, such as dry, don't repeat yourself. KISS, keep it simple, stupid, including scheduled code reviews, using code analysis tools, and including refactoring sessions. So that way, the quality of your automation code is solid for the duration in which you are working on that automation code base and adding new features. So keeping that framework as an upfront concern is important for any automation team to maintain success over time. The last area that I'm going to talk about is lagging behind development as a challenge. And this is one that I've seen everywhere I've been at. We see development will continue going on long, And, oh, now we're ready with a couple days left before we have to deliver for testing to go through. And all testing activities have to be fit within that. And then once we're done, we're going to skip around and start with the development work all over again. So we have no time to go back, even after it's in production. So you need to bake in automation feasibility into the definition of ready, and your completed scripts into your definition of done. You want to make automation part of your SDLC, not an exception, but rather a standard. Getting people to change their behavior will be probably the greatest challenge that you face. One of the ways in which you can convince them to change is by showing that empirical evidence, that by us not being able to test this feature, we have these escape defects to go to production, or us not being able to automate across all the environments has led to us lacking in test coverage or application quality. Showing with evidence why it's important to bake in automation into your SDLC will help make sure that automation is part of an upfront concern. You want your automation to complete it concurrently with development, so that when the developers are done, you can simply plug in the additional values. If we're talking about locators for the UI on either web or mobile, or data components that we know because we've established standards for how we generate and work on our data. This will help ensure that our automation stays in line with our development work. How do we bake it into our schedule, though? How do we make this something standard practice? There are a few techniques that you can use, one of which I'm going to share with you today. This was generated by Matt Wynn a few years ago. It is called example mapping. It is part of that behavior-driven development where you discover what the behaviors are going to be, you formulate your specifications, and ideally, you be able to automate those specifications so they are executable. Let's take a look at what example mapping is and how it applies to automation. Well, we start with actually note cards of all things. So in an example mapping session, you have your equivalent of your three amigos: developer, a tester, and a representative of your product, whether that be a product owner, a project manager, or a business analyst. Your focus is on a single story, a feature to be developed. For that feature, you're going to identify one or more business rules. This is your business logic that you must implement. For each rule, you're going to identify one or more examples that will illustrate that business rule. And if anyone in the room has questions that no one in the room can answer, you identify those on those red question cards, something to be called out and brought back to, say, an architect or your marketing department or a team that has been cross-impacted to answer. Why is this valuable for automation? Well, that business logic on those blue rule cards, those are some pretty good candidates for integration and potentially unit tests, depending upon how discrete we've made those rules. Those examples are great for our user behavior if we want to create some BDD-style tests. They will at least give us an idea up front that we have good business logic coverage, because for every rule, we have at least one example that will illustrate that rule. So example mapping is powerful in that those examples can end up becoming our user scenarios that we use. It also helps establish a shared understanding amongst the team of what should be done for the story and who is responsible for what. The rules that we write end up becoming our acceptance criteria. It empowers the team. If the team does not feel comfortable at the end of an example mapping session, they can simply vote no, give it a thumbs down. Additional work needs to be done on that user story before it enters the team space. It additionally prevents us from having to do a lot of rework or work on large or unclear stories. And here's why. If on an example map you see a lot of red question cards, that is a very good indication development work is not ready to begin. But you have action items from that session. We need these questions answered by outside individuals or other members of the team. If you have a lot of blue business rules underneath a single user story, that's an indication that that story is too dense and it needs to be broken apart into 2 or more stories. If you have too many examples underneath a single business rule, that is an indication that business rule is too dense and you need to break it apart into 2 or more rules. So the color coding does matter, as well as how many of a given color card do you have on the example map. It empowers the team. It helps us keep our stories short. It helps us focus for our unit and integration and functional tests, and ensures that we have good coverage of our business logic. This is the power of using example mapping to make automation an upfront concern. We'll know what tests we have to write, and we know that it has good coverage for our application. So I mentioned early on that we should adopt a lot of quality standards with regards to code reviews and refactoring sessions and other activities to help ensure our automation is successful for the long term. So this is what I mean by it. Regression review is one of those such meetings you can hold. In a regression review, your test lead, or whoever you want to identify as that lead for a team, is going to compile a list of all the new release scripts and regression scripts. You're going to have support from production support analysts who are going to give you metrics on the incidents that occurred for the application prior to the release and beyond that, as well as your business partners providing you metrics on application usage broken down by feature. So again, you can focus on those most valuable features. And your app manager or product owner will provide a list of any upcoming projects so you know what the roadmap is going to be. In this regression review, you're going to use an evidence-based approach to determine what are the features that should have good automation coverage around, where are we lacking, what needs to be modified or removed, so you can focus on areas that we had production incidents on. You can focus on, hey, the highest used or most revenue generating parts of our application, as well as have a good idea of what the roadmap's going to be. So, hey, this feature is going to be modified or removed in a few months, so we shouldn't invest as much time in it. So doing this an evidence-based approach for a regression review is valuable to ensuring your automation is in good shape. There are a lot of superheroes presented throughout this presentation. My superhero is an Avenger. His name is Martin Fowler. So here I have him with a cape saying, I'm not a great programmer, I'm just a good programmer with great habits. And we should follow Martin Fowler's advice for our test automation by using code reviews and refactoring. So we adopt the same approach and expectation that we have for our development code by conducting regular code reviews for all of the tests we're putting into our suite. So we're going to ensure that all those candidate automation scripts are indeed included, that the quality of the code is solid, and that they're understandable by the team. So our code reviews are going to help us to ensure that those features and scenarios currently reflect the state of the application. So even if someone did not work on a feature, via that code review from a colleague, they can start to understand a little bit more about the domain application. And then we've addressed all those upfront concerns about formatting and data needs and environmental needs. If we expect our developers to conduct code reviews to maintain their application under test, then certainly the test automation we write should also be subject to these code reviews to ensure the overall quality of our application. In addition to code reviews, you should conduct regular refactoring sessions. As a reminder, when we're refactoring, we're focused on the maintainability of our code, the extensibility of that code, and domain knowledge, following along with the principles that we should focus on improving performance. We should look into non-orthogonal design and ensure we don't repeat ourselves and we don't have scripts that become tangled and dependent upon each other. We don't want to duplicate our work, and we don't want to have tests there that don't reflect the current state of the application, that is outdated. But how do you actually make this real for, say, a refactoring session rather than saying, hey, we should refactor? The way in which I do it is I require my teams that I support to conduct regular refactoring sessions for an application under test. Identify a team leader that person is responsible for scheduling that meeting, delegating any work, selecting a focus area, and generating any bug reports. They will be joined in a meeting with the rest of their team, as well as an external automation guide. This automation guide will serve as that technical oracle that's going to keep track of what's going on in the session and any action items generated, and be responsible for that improvement status report. That outside guide is to ensure we have that external view into the application, so someone's not bogged down with specific domain knowledge that will start to use jargon. And to provide some additional guardrails, we say, hey, here are the focus areas that you can select from each meeting, whether that's a code metric report, a single feature item that you're working in that current sprint or implementation phase. What's going on with the overall project release? Let's focus on the tests of those, or our regression, or even our CI report. So emails that we send off that have the execution or heat maps associated with it. Providing these guardrails in this structure will help ensure that refactoring sessions occur on a regular basis. As for our code reviews, we can ensure those happen on a regular basis dependent upon the tools you use. If you use, say, Azure DevOps, you can require each commit, each pull request to have multiple reviewers before it's actually merged into master. Encouraging and putting in place these sort of guardrails will help make our best practices part of the standard. So in summary, what did we learn today? Well, we learned that we should focus on those fastest, most robust tests, unit and service level tests. We absolutely need UI and end-to-end tests because those reflect ultimately the behavior of our users. But we should have as many unit and service tests as are needed to ensure our application quality. We should also build based on the probability of failure, the impact on our business, and the complexity of those scenarios, so we can let our human testers take on more valuable tasks and let the automated checks do their work. And lastly, we have to keep in mind that when we're working on automation or selecting tools or an approach, that for our strategy, we need to take into account what the budget, schedule, and technical skill set of our people and our organization is, because that will ultimately determine what tactics we take to achieve our overall aim. So thank you very much for your time. Eran, I know you have a few additional points and questions you'd like to bring up, and for the rest of the folks, you can feel free to ask questions, and Eran and I will get back to you.
Sure. Again, Thomas, amazing presentation, great insights, and these are real life insights. So these are precious, and thank you for sharing them with us. And thank you for this unique design of this presentation. Makes it very cool. We have received a bunch of questions, so I prioritize them based on the difficulty, so stay tuned. The first one, Thomas, you mentioned that there is no one size fits all, right? You mentioned that there is no one specific test automation framework that would fit each and every practitioner because there are skill sets and requirements, different testing types, and so forth. So one of the questions that came in was, how do you maintain over time test automation scenarios across these different frameworks? So let's break it. You have unit testing, you have integration and functional testing, some of them UI, and there can be some cross overlapping test automation scenarios that you want to maintain. How do you synchronize the maintenance across these different test automation frameworks or tools?
Yeah, I think that goes to overall guidelines that can help you out. So in terms of what fits where, oftentimes I've seen in my work that tests that should be unit tests end up being written as those functional UI-driven tests, like validating that every state appears in a select list dropdown. Like that's not a functional UI test because that's not a user behavior. So as an upfront, having at least those guidelines in place for should be a unit test, this should be an integration, and this should be a functional test that the team follows as a set of standards is good. In terms of the technology itself, Like, it's a big investment for any tool you select or to have the multiple tools, which is why I try to keep the tech stack as small as possible with my recommendation of, all right, we want to make sure that we write our automated tests ideally in the same language as our development code base. And if that's not possible, then let's select tools that have the lowest maintenance overhead if we don't have people that are fully dedicated to this. Another way to approach it is making sure that our development team also owns quality, as in having them write some of those acceptance tests, so that way they're responsible for the maintenance of the overall application, which can include our unit and integration testing framework. So ultimately, quality should be a shared responsibility among everyone on the team. So making it part of people's regular job, as in their day-to-day, to maintain this quality through the support of our tech stack should be baked into people's, you could say, performance reviews if you want to, but more along the lines of making it part of the shared agreement for the team. For this week, this person is helping support. This week, that person is helping to support, to help ensure that we follow good quality standards.
Awesome. And actually, you just mentioned performance, so it ties into one of the other questions that we got about, do you have any tips to, I would hate to use, again, this shift left concept, but how do you bake in the build cycle or, in the CI pipeline, this non-functional testing? Can be performance, can be accessibility that you mentioned earlier. Do you have any good practice within your teams that you have managed over the years?
Yeah. So, I'll speak to one of them directly. So we'll say the accessibility tests. So there are a lot of outside firms that offer accessibility testing, as well as some open source tools that do so. What my advice is, try to integrate with your existing automation framework that is that UI path driven, because you want to stop and check accessibility on top of your existing tests that already navigate through the site. So you should bake that in either as a separate activity or as part of your build deployment pipeline for any new features that you executed on top of your existing regressions suite that's running. From the, say, performance perspective, again, there's the option of you do this as potentially a separate activity, and I've worked at a couple companies that did just do that as a separate activity as sort of readiness. Alternatively, and this is what I recommend, is you select a tool. There are several open source and commercial tools. There are dozens of performance testing tools, but you select one that you can integrate into your build deployment pipeline, whether you are using Circle CI, Azure DevOps Pipeline, Jenkins X, Bamboo. You bake it into the build deployment pipeline so that it executes as soon as that code is deployed into environment with a set of threshold standards that you have for responsiveness and load of the application. My opinion, you try to automate as much of these as possible so that way you don't wait months before you find out, ooh, we have a performance issue. Or you wait months before you do your single one sort of like addressment of ADA testing, or you end up getting sued because you are not ADA compliant because you have a very low like lead time for that testing cycle to continue. So I recommend baking it into your existing CI/CD pipelines as best as possible, and leverage and have it ride on top of your existing automation where possible to keep your tech stack small.
Excellent, Thomas. And by the way, Perfecto, we have also full integration support both for accessibility and performance testing, so you can check it out as well on our website. Try using it as well as your non-functional testing. We have time for one more question, Thomas, and I think it plays quite nicely into the theme of this webinar, Superheroes, the Future. So one of the questions was, okay, so we have learned a lot of good practices in this webinar, and we're starting to see a lot of, codeless and machine learning. But Perfecto is also offering a codeless solution, which is machine learning based. Are these new technologies, machine learning, codeless solutions, going to disrupt some of these best practices, or they are going to kind of play nicely into these recommendations?
I think it plays nicely into, one of the topics I mentioned earlier is when you're looking at tools and framework and technical skill set, you make those decisions of, do we have people that are, true have a background as developer or not? And do we also have the time? So using these codeless solutions are just as viable as people who are building out entire frameworks from scratch, and that if it fits your company profile can be very valuable, and it can be that sort of easier path to you achieving success. Like, it matters about what your profile is of your company, the budget you have, the people you have for what you're doing. So I think codeless solutions can be very valuable. Using AI and ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning, is going to provide additional avenues for testing that our traditional automation does not have in place. So those are areas to look forward to today and in the future to adopt into your overall strategy.
This is great. I wanted, before we conclude, again, to thank you, Thomas, for this exciting session. And with your permission, I wanted to push to the audience 2 slides that you have able to share in this presentation that weren't delivered, but they are in the appendix. So one of the slides is about some recommended books that you would recommend practitioners, test automation architects to focus on. So everyone that is online and is going to get the recording, you have in the appendix a bunch of supporting slides that you can refer to with recommended books, as well as some references to some of the things that Thomas mentioned. So definitely check these references and books out going forward. Any other last comment from you, Thomas, before we conclude this webinar?
Yeah, so I would say as a last comment that for folks who are interested in the presentation, I do have a section built in here for some metrics that you can use to sort of help understand your progress. Reach out, and more than happy to, I know Perfecto will provide the PDF of this presentation for you to reference. And of course, you can reach out to Eran or myself online, and would be more than happy to help you out.
Definitely. So with that, Thomas, thank you for the maybe 10th time today for delivering this webinar. It was really exciting, really insightful. I'm getting also the same feedback from the guys online. So we will be sharing both the recording and the slides with you in the upcoming few days. So thank you for joining. Thank you, Thomas, and stay safe, and we'll meet you in the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.